second part of our event, which would be a roundtable panel. And I'm handing it over to Hanny Ben Israel. So thank you very, very much, Professor Mulali, again, for being here with us. And Hanny, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Hanny Ben Israel. I'm an attorney. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Law at Tel Aviv University and a member of the TraffLab research project led by Hila for over 4 years now at the faculty. I'm delighted to chair this roundtable that will conclude this event. We are about to hear from a group of truly wonderful scholars, all of whom have written innovatively and thoughtfully and critically on anti-trafficking law and policy in different national contexts and on labor exploitation more generally. Thank you very much again to all the speakers for agreeing to participate and engage with TraffLab's alternative anti-trafficking action plan. I will introduce all 4 speakers. Each of the speakers will have between 15 and 20 minutes to present. And we will then open it up for questions and discussion. We will first hear from Joel Quirk, who is a professor of politics at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. He's the author or co-editor of 8 books, including Research is More Than Extraction, Knowledge Production and Gender-Based Violence in African Societies, forthcoming with the University of Ohio Press. Joel's research focuses on enslavement and abolition, mobility and work, social movements and contentious politics, gender and violence, and the politics and history of Africa. He's a founding editor of Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, where his most recent project was entitled, It is Time to Get Off the Fence on Sex Worker Rights. Janie Trang is a professor of law who teaches and writes in the areas of international law, human trafficking, and labor migration. Drawing on her expertise in human trafficking issues, Professor Trang has served as an advisor to the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, and the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Professor Trang's scholarship has been published in the American Journal of International Law, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, and cited in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Guardian, among others. Professor Trang currently serves as member of the Freedom Network USA and as an advisor to the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Janie Trang will be followed by Virginia Mantuvalu, who is a professor of human rights and labor law at UCL, Faculty of Laws. She has published extensively on workers' exploitation, workers' rights, and human rights. She recently received a British Academy mid-career fellowship to work on a monograph on structural injustice and workers' rights, which is forthcoming by Oxford University Press. She has also received a UCL Provost Award for Public Engagement for her research collaboration with the UK NGO Kalayan, working on the rights of domestic workers. And finally, we will hear from Maayan Yesna, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in modern slavery and human rights at the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights, University of Oxford, and a fellow of the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Center. Her research focuses on trafficking for labor exploitation and the regulation of labor migration. She holds a PhD from Kent Law School. Prior to her doctoral studies, she led the legal work on trafficking at the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants Israel, המוקד לפליטים ומהגרים, and worked on issues related to trafficking at the Office of the National Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, Israeli Ministry of Justice, and UNHCR. So without further ado, Joel, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Cool. Okay, I just want to take this opportunity to firstly thank Hila and Maayan for the invitation. And I have to confess, I've been following TraffLab from afar, and it's always been my impression that it's doing the kind of work that a lot of us in the field have been calling for a long time. And it's really nice to see the products of that work up close. And I really got a lot out of reading the report. I want to take this opportunity in my time here to step back a little bit from the issues associated with sorry, this is the wrong way to say this. I want to take the report as an opportunity to reflect upon the relationship between politics and policy. So what I want to do here is to think about some of the strategic and tactical questions that I think this report provokes and leads us to. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about how detailed, granular recommendations that are found in a report such as this one come into contact with the cold face of political interests and legislative agendas and the broader kind of penumbras and sociological forces that are associated with human trafficking as a kind of platform and symbol and site for contestation. So this is my agenda. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to be quite quick in terms of mapping out the backstory, and I want to use this as a provocation for thinking about where the labor approach to trafficking leaves us within both a policy and political context. So at the risk of briefly revisiting some of Hila's introduction, I just want to start by highlighting what I regard as the structural dynamics associated with the issues that kind of confront us, both in this conversation and then more broadly. So I'm not suggesting any great insight here, but when it comes to questions of labor exploitation, extreme and otherwise, and the things we've come to call trafficking, we know that the problems arise out of structural dynamics. We have a bunch of political economy issues and the interests of people within economic structures to reproduce and extend these systems in ways that extend their interests. So we have subcontracting, outsourcing, financial incentives to look the other way when exploitation occurs, wage theft as a business model, gender division of labor, and then further we have issues associated with migration and vulnerability. And I particularly emphasize here the barriers to collective organization and mobilization, because this is ultimately what the value of migration from a labor market structural perspective ends up, wherein it's harder for workers, given the ways in which they're positioned within labor markets, to effectively organize and bargain in order to protect and defend their interests. So this, from a labor standpoint, is what I regard as the underlying issues that sit behind this thing that we're grappling with. Now we have the standard solution, and this has been covered at length in the report. We have prosecution protection, the fetishization of law as a solution, where we celebrate all laws that are passed, no matter how horrible they are. This heavy investments in criminal justice, raid and rescue, raising awareness, even if it's not particularly effective or useful, we can always have more of it. Training programs, the manipulation of human trafficking as a pretext for border protection, and then finally, and this is worth dwelling on a little bit, the sex work silo, wherein much of the field, for all intents and purposes, is not engaged in a conversation about labor, insofar as it doesn't specifically impinge with issues associated with commercial sex exploitation. And I think the report is admirably clear in saying on page 12 that the anti-trafficking approach reaches a very small number of individuals, and there's no sign that it deters or reduces occurrence of human trafficking. I just want to stop and pause here and say, this is not overly surprising, that there's a fundamental mismatch between the solutions that have been opposed for addressing human trafficking and labor exploitation and the structural dynamics that I outlined in the previous slide. So we shouldn't be surprised when the standard solution fails. And given the context, we already have a wealth of evidence that suggests categorically that it has failed. Then we have the alternative plan. And I have to confess, I was putting a slide together here and I couldn't actually get to all of the recommendations that are associated with the report. This is kind of some of a very comprehensive portfolio that I think very much ties the details in their specificity in terms of what you do in order to address a problem that is ultimately associated with the design of a labor market and a migration regime. I should just note briefly as a caveat, I think as an invitation, I would have perhaps liked to see slightly more input on the financing of regulatory regimes. So it strikes me that we know labor inspections are super useful as long as they're not immigration agents, but we don't really know how we're going to fund them. And we also know a lot of the types of regulatory solutions that you need in order to bend the curve in terms of how labor markets operate require regulation that needs to be paid for. And I think a plan such as this should spend a little bit more time on how we're going to fund this stuff. And is it a surcharge out of a construction industry? Is it a pooled set of resources and so on? But anyway, I guess that's an aside. So I think the alternative plan has a lot to recommend it. And if we were engaged in an exercise where we were going to put up a bunch of policy solutions on a board and pick the ones that we think are going to be most successful, we would very quickly and easily move from the standard plan to the alternative one. And here, and I have to concede there is always a but, I want to dwell a little bit here on how politics bends policy. So I want to suggest that there's two major paths available when it comes to combating human trafficking. We can try and identify, isolate, and assist a small number of exceptional cases. They're very hard to find, they're very hard to identify, they're very hard to disentangle from labor markets. And tracking down and then trying to assist specific individuals is a recipe for failure logistically and practically and politically, but it's still extremely attractive because it doesn't require changes to the underlying design of the labor markets, which people are within society are economically and politically benefiting from in various ways. So I want to suggest here that of these two solutions, if we assess them solely in policy terms, we're always going to go for two, yet there's very powerful incentives that constantly bring us back to one. And I want to suggest here that high levels of political support for ending human trafficking remain contingent upon the continued dominance of ineffective and self-serving solutions. I also want to further complicate things by just throwing onto the table two additional considerations. One is the massive growth of technocracy tied, as Janie's demonstrated, through philanthrocapitalism and tech against trafficking and other places, where there's a temptation to stand outside politics. And we see this with all the various financial regulatory arrangements and instruments and initiatives and conversations where there's a impulse to deny these political dynamics by shifting into a technocratic frame where you just have to pretend that politics isn't really politics and everyone is on the same side. At the same time, we also have these sociological forces that, while they're slightly embarrassing and weird, actually comprise a significant way in which people understand and engage with questions associated with trafficking. And if your starting point for thinking about trafficking is the idea that there's an evil cabal of Democrats and Hollywood celebrities harvesting children for the purposes of creating an agent that keeps you forever young, this invariably has very significant challenges in terms of our capacity to stretch and mobilize and engage with questions of labor regimes and regulation. So these, to me, are the challenges. What does this mean in terms of connecting policy and politics? Here, I want to pose a couple of questions, and I'm sure my time is close to up. So I'll just put them on the floor and then seed. The first question I want to raise is, what is the relationship tactically and politically between the conventional model and the alternative model? Because I was gratified in the report to see that the conventional critique of the standard kind of problems associated with anti-trafficking is mercifully brief. And we now have a very significant body that points to all the problems of anti-trafficking. But if we just set the alternative model up on a parallel path and go, you do the conventional model and we do the alternative one, you risk ceding ground to the OECD-led organized crime, border protection, sex work, opposition, stuff that is at the heart of the field. So I think there's a tactical question here about whether the alternative model is a parallel path that sits alongside, you do your thing, we do ours, and we get on with dealing with labor market regimes while this other stuff is happening over there. And I think this is potentially a difficult question because it means that the collateral damages and harms associated with anti-trafficking get put in a box. It means that the co-optation of anti-trafficking for the purposes of border protection get put in a box. And it also means that there's a difficult question to be had about the extent to which the anti-trafficking conversation is displacing or diluting or deflecting conversations about migrant and worker rights. So I think from a tactical standpoint, it needs to be clarified how the two models fit together politically and institutionally. The second point I want to raise is how do we feel about the highly individualized narratives of suffering and exploitation that sit at the heart of the politics of anti-trafficking? Because these have always been the hinge around which political mobilizations take place. And again, this report is notable in its absence in the sense of not foregrounding that particular style of writing and engagement. But at the same time, it strikes me that there's potentially trade-offs associated with that, where is it worth trying to stay in that frame because of the attention it draws, or is it actually better to lower the temperature and to kind of instead engage with people within society and politics without the specter of this figure of the exceptionalized human trafficking victim standing at the heart of it all? So I'm interested here in whether that frame continues to be useful, and if it doesn't, other people are still going to use it. So what does that mean? And then thirdly, how much can we stretch anti-trafficking? Is there a point where this isn't really about trafficking and this is ultimately a question about the design and operation of labor markets and how migrants are inserted in them in ways that are designed to render them vulnerable? At which point is it really a conversation about how workers need to just be treated better as workers and migrants need to be treated better as migrants? And ultimately, this focus on labor trafficking is at some level disingenuous, because the ultimate goal that sits behind this is that we really should just treat workers and migrants better, at which point is there gains or losses to be made politically and strategically by shifting off or supplementing a trafficking frame with other frames. And then I just briefly mentioned this. I am a little uncomfortable that the report puts sex work aside in the way that it puts sex work aside. And I think that there are good political and strategic reasons for that. But at the same time, I think that has the effects that I pointed to earlier as potentially an issue. And I guess I'll leave it there. And then finally, and this is it, I just wonder whether the language is less important than the political mobilizations that are either present or absent in a particular context or political scenario. I think this is something that both lawyers and academics do, where if we can find the right language, this language will kind of unlock a key and it will mobilize people in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be mobilized. And it often strikes me that while this argument is not inconsequential, and I fully concede that I've engaged in my share of it, I often wonder whether it's more about the political coalitions and organization and mobilization that kind of sits off the stage of these kinds of conversations about which terms to use and how to deploy and define them. So I'll leave that there, and I hope that was somewhat useful.
Well, thank you very much for this series of absolutely pressing, urgent, and profound questions. I think these are the profound questions of this field that you raised in your talk. So thank you very much. I'm sure there will be a very interesting discussion to follow up in the Q&A.